quote Bergson. He argues that memory is very much tied in with duration, and duration is how we get from moment to moment. And we don't get from moment to moment by drawing upon a memory, in effect, learning from it, and then moving on. That memory, in a way, is like a snowball effect that pushes us into the future as it goes, as an agglomeration. He says, duration is the continuous progress of the past which gnaws into the future and which swells as it advances. And as the past grows without ceasing, so also there is no limit to its preservation. So it's a constant accumulation, snowball effect, that's producing new memories as it goes, which encourages you to, in a way, create new futures as you go. It's inherently a creative act. Now, here's where I'm going to introduce my fourth character, Proust. It's no accident that Proust read Bergson early on in his life, and his magnum opus, À la recherche du temps perdu, is heavily influenced by his readings of Bergson, and particularly Bergson's notions of memory that I've just been talking about. And it's no accident also that Jean-Francois' work is in very much a kind of Proustian machinic organization of memory in much the same way. If you remember, if you've ever read Proust, the novel itself is organized as a giant flashback and series of flashbacks within flashbacks. It's not organized linearly. Memory then is the driving motor of how the narrative is formed. It's also not a novel where Marcel Proust, the writer, is remembering his past. He has a narrator who is a character who happens to be called Marcel, like he himself. But Marcel is not Marcel Proust. Marcel is a character undergoing an apprenticeship in which he uses different kinds of memory to draw on his past as a composite, in much the same way that these machines work, in order to find himself in a position where he's ready to write a novel about his experiences. So it's the apprenticeship of a writer, using memory as the motor mechanism of the creative act. Many people think that the novel he will eventually write is the novel you've just read, and then other critics disagree that there's no way that that could be true, because if it is an apprenticeship, it has to be a different novel entirely. Now, what's interesting about this is that there are two kinds of memory in Proust, just as there are at least two kinds of memory in this work. So-called voluntary memory, which is very much tied in with the kind of motor action I was talking about in terms of ducking the eraser going through the air, where you call up the memory needed to do the appropriate action. Now, this is not a kind of memory that's particularly conducive to art, because it's very much one built around rote action. There's also involuntary memory, which of course is the most famous memory in Proust, brought about by him biting into the Madeleine after dipping it into the tea when he's an older man, which brings flooding into his mind the same action that he did as a child back in Cambrai, where he grew up. And all of a sudden, the past and the present have coincided, and he can't really tell the difference between the two. It's involuntary memory, in effect, that triggers the past as it was then as present and brings it up into the current present so that it can then become the stuff of the novel that you're reading. But voluntary memory and involuntary memory both have their drawbacks for the creative person. One is too much of a rote. It would be me like reorganizing Jean-Francois' pieces here and basically thinking, well, I kind of like the horizontals here. Maybe I can find some horizontals in the one next to it and create a kind of correlation between them. Well, this is sort of a horizontal here. And it's a very contrived way of forging linkages between things, either vertically or horizontally. Involuntary memory would entail me doing it at random in a way, like closing my eyes and seeing what I came up with. But that's pretty much like a black hole. You have very little control over what you're actually producing. The ideal memory is the one that is neither of those two, but is in effect a pure creative act. This is what the French philosopher Gilles Deleuze calls a transversal. And I would argue that Jean-Francois' work, in a way, is a transverse machine that allows us to create transverse connections between things that defy both voluntary and involuntary memory, to create new composites that didn't exist before. Now, a transverse connector is a passage without interval that affirms a specific difference, all the better to disclose the essence of time that underpins all apparent artistic unities. What do we mean by that? Well, if you look into Proust, for example, the novel is organized into two ways. There's the so-called Méséglise way, or Swan's way, which Marcel's family reach by going out their back gate from their garden. And it's the way that they take on walks when the weather's going to be fine, because it's of a certain distance. It's also one where it goes through Swan's estate, which is a very bourgeois area of the community. And there are certain people that they meet on a regular basis who belong to that way. And this is the way that Marcel knows from his early childhood. Then when he becomes a young man and he goes into society, he discovers the gourmand way, which is the way that passes through the estate of the Duke and Duchess of Gourmand, where they have these highfalutin salons. He meets members of the aristocracy and the art world. And this is a way that the families sometimes go on, but only under certain circumstances, because it's a longer route, and if they get caught in the rain, they'll get drenched. So that's a way, again, that they have to go on when the sun's shining. So each way has its different associations, and they're very, very self-contained. And they also have their different system of language, going back to Saussure, where Marcel eventually learns how to decode what's going on Swan's way, but has to learn a whole new set of codes when he's entered into society, because one set don't match the other. He's got to relearn from scratch. So in effect, what's going on in memory in Proust is a distinction between these two ways with little or no connector between them. However, through involuntary memory and the act of the creation of the novel itself through art, you get a crisscrossing across and between these two ways that muddies the difference between them. And you get composites built, little bridges between them, transversals, as a result of the structure of the novel itself, produced by different kinds of memory. So in effect, what you get then is the rigid vertical and horizontal structures of language represented by the two ways start to break down. And what I see in Jean-Francois' work here is a similar thing. It's a breakdown of those rigid structures through memory working in very indirect, ambivalent, transverse ways across and between images, produced simply by changing the arrangement of the images. Now, I've written a little short description of one of these at work to show you how it functions. And it's this one here. So after the talk, if you want to check this out and see what I'm talking about, but you might be able to see it from where you're seated. If we read this from left to right, and there is a general tendency for spectators to come into this work, regardless of what these images mean for Jean-Francois, we put our own spin on them in accordance with what they conjure for us. We, in effect, not only impose our own memories on them, but they actually construct and create memories by virtue of their content. Many of us read them horizontally because that's our general tendency, but some people come in and just twirl it around vertically and ignore the horizontal. And that maybe tells you a lot more about the spectator than it does the works themselves. I have a general tendency to read things horizontally from left to right because I come out of film studies and I come out of film editing and the whole issue of, you know, splicing this next to this, next to this, next to this, because my general training is oriented that way. Well, here, the first image on the left is 3 pairs of naked women's legs protruding like synchronized swimmers from the ocean between 2 semi-anthropomorphic rocks. Okay, that's how it works for me. Next to it, 3 abstracted women at 3 identical windows. So we've already got the pattern of women and threes and structures right there to link one with the other. 3, a Madonna and child between 2 vertical color hue strips entitled The Many-Colored Child, which is here. Again, a kind of trinity or triptych form resembling the kinds of paintings that you would see in churches. Again, though, the issue of motherhood, fecundity, birth, etc., etc. And then the final image, a ghostly Madonna and child, which you can't really see from a distance, but it's in this purple middle here, in the center of 2 interconnecting circles superimposed on a mesh-covered heart here. The text above and below the latter reads, obscure object of desire. And this is an inverse of the top one so that it reads like a tarot card. Anyway, that's what it means to me. And this is what I say about it. And then, again, this is just me. Your interpretation would almost certainly be very different because the memories that it's tapping into are going to be different. Using a little simple free association, we might conjure a series of connotations that connects water with birth, women with situations connected to both looking and being looked at, to that of the Madonna as both a Christian icon and a symbol of high Renaissance painting. These loose connections are typical, actually, of Freudian dream logic. They create a chain of desire, but defy semantic closure. In Freud, dream logic, his horizontal axis, that of narrative linkage, is what he calls displacement. And that of the paradigm, the vertical axis, is what he calls condensation. The unconscious, the dream, is itself structured like a language. These are directly tapping in to dream language.